everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Clear as Mud, where we talk to game developers from all walks of life about their personal and professional journeys. I'm your host, Graham Waldrop. As always, our show is presented by Mudstack, the only asset management and collaboration tool custom built for game studios and digital artists. For more information, head over to mudstack.com. On today's episode, we welcome Brad Myers, lead character artist at ProbablyMonsters. Brad has been working in the industry since 2008 and has worked on multiple games in the Call of Duty franchise, including Vanguard, Black Ops, and Cold War. So anybody who's listened to this show knows that I love getting into the weeds. I love getting to the weeds with our guests and getting really technical about their process. Even if it's about something I don't know much about or will never do. Character modeling is one of those things, but it didn't stop Brad and I from having a really, really cool conversation about the ins and outs of it. And we go deep, we talk about how Ponytail interacts with the character it's attached to, how it's rigged and animated, and how it has to respond to how the model is actually modeled, and how do you actually make a ponytail for a character and things like that. So it's a really cool conversation. If you've ever been interested in character modeling, or if you haven't been, you're going to learn something. It's a really cool conversation. Brad's at the top of his field, so you're going to get a lot out of this episode. And here's Brad. Enjoy. With a project like Call of Duty Vanguard, that one goes back to World War II, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in terms of your role as working on characters, right? Can you take us through what that's like to sort of go from concept to modeling to rigging animation and bringing it sort of all the way home? And then, not necessarily have to go tell us about your pipeline and all the things that you can't talk about, but just from a high level view, how do you guys figure all that out?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because basically the way that it all starts out is it's an idea, right? And they're trying to secure funding for it, and it happens at such a high level in the very beginning that we don't even really know about it because they don't want us to get excited or get our hopes up or whatever. We had some other sort of secret internal projects going on, and those were really cool. And I was actually in a position where I was the only character artist on one of the teams, so I got to have quite a lot of experience in a leadership type role in that case, which felt great, But whenever we secured the deal on that next Call of Duty Vanguard, the second World War II game that Sledgehammer would make, basically the way that started out was the thought that we're in a bit of a crunch in terms of trying to release a game with this every year cadence, and they thought, okay, well, we have a lot of assets from the first World War II game internally at Sledgehammer, and we have a lot of knowledge of what it means to make a game in that specific era. Maybe we can make this massive game faster, given all these circumstances. The reality is, on the character art team, it's not really true because they wanted so many more characters. They wanted everything upgraded. So essentially what wound up happening is we were working a lot harder and sort of reaching out to all kinds of resources as much as possible. But we did deliver on that. But essentially, going back to the initial question, it starts out with an idea. It sort of trickles down to all of us, and we start thinking about planning. How are we going to actually accomplish this? Character art team specifically, we get some concept. It might be literally starting out as the lead, just pulling inspiration type stuff off the internet or film or whatever. There's usually go ahead.
Is the plot already written at this point, or a basic overview of who these people are, or is it sort of everything's kind of being done simultaneously?
Yeah. So my experience is working in games is the plot and the story and all that comes they mash it together at the very end in a frantic state. It's seriously that blows my mind. Having grown up playing games, thinking there's some master plan behind all this stuff, and the reality is a lot of times it's sort of oh, so we made all this stuff. We kind of need a story. Let's do that real quick. And I personally believe that's not the right way to do it. However, it's so complex making a game. There's a lot of like proving that you can actually make something at the quality level that they need. And in terms of like that perspective, the storyline does not matter. It's like generally it's like, can we make like a little snippet? They call it a vertical slice of the game, and just this is just like maybe 5-10 minutes of playing the game, trying to shoot for highest quality. If you do, you're greenlit and you proceed with making the game. If you don't, they might start investigating other options.
Right.
So I think that's a big reason for that.
It's interesting too, because it seems like a lot of stories for games are retrofitted around the game's design. And it's amazing when those stories are pulled off really well too, because it's like it's not given the same amount of attention and development out of necessity, it seems like.
That's true, yeah. And essentially they have like incredible talent working on this stuff that are really good at making something feel nice, even given these circumstances. One game that I worked on was quite a while back before Vanguard was Rage, and that game was, a lot of people don't know this, but that game was supposed to be like super, super long, and they basically cut it off halfway through it because they just ran out of time. And so like, but if you ever play that game, they allude to a lot of stuff happening like in the future in the game, and then all of a sudden you're like, credits roll, and so yes, things get cut off and all kinds of stuff, and so the story is like oftentimes not completely seen from the player.
Right. So you're making these characters without really having like an idea of what the story's going to be, or who the characters are as characters. Maybe not necessarily how they're going to look, but who they are as people.
Yeah, totally. Like, so they like to give us bios at some point, but sometimes they don't even, they literally will tell the person to do the character. There is a bio somewhere, somebody thought about some things, and they don't even share it with the character artist. Like they might forget or something. So, so it's like, it's not as like a well-oiled machine in that respect as you might think originally. Right. It almost took some digging for me to find out information about the characters.
That's got to put you guys behind the 8 ball, especially as a lead.
Yeah.
So what the heck do you tell your team, right? It's like, this is a girl, this guy, they're from somewhere, making badass, I guess, right?
yeah. I mean, a lot of times it is like, okay, we have a concept that the concept team put a lot of love into, and like I said, initially it is like just inspiration stuff, getting started out. But then usually at some point we'll have like a very specific concept. Sometimes it's like kind of fuzzy and you don't know what some things are. You're like, I'm pretty sure that's a strap, but I can't really tell, Mm-hmm. But yeah, it is like, okay, well, here's your concept. Just try to make it one-to-one with that, or fill in the blanks of things that you don't see. So, I mean, I will say that like in terms of like for what we do as character artists, it's not like the most important thing in the world, because the fact of the matter is we need to create this character, which essentially is a statue, right? We're not animating it, but we do have to make sure that we use topology with it that makes it very friendly for animation. So if we have all the bells and whistles and it animates, it's kind of like, all right, well, the character is happening a lot in the animation, and maybe the voice acting and facial stuff.
Right.
We didn't even really work on heads a lot of the time. It was we had a guy that like mostly all he did was heads, and it's a very technical role, at least in at Sledgehammer with Call of Duty stuff. It was Call of Duty stuff in general. We would hire like actual actors. And we'd have like a lineup. We'd be like, okay, this is our first choice for the actor's head. This is our second choice, this other guy. This is our third choice. And so there'd be like 5 or 6 options, because oftentimes those actors would cancel or not show up or something. And then essentially, once they had them and they scanned their heads, then it was like very technical in terms of like cleaning it up and getting the textures and stuff in. So like even still, like it's like when we're making this body, we might not really know what the head's gonna be.
Right.
You know?
Have you ever been in a scenario where like whole body is scanned and not just the face, or are we not at that point yet?
Yeah, so we try to leverage stuff as much as possible. So we will scan bodies. We actually had we do have we have a male and female mannequin that is set up in the exact T pose of the character meshes. And what we do is we buy clothes from like army surplus stores and stuff, and then we literally like dress them up and then like have this super expensive scanning machine. It's like 200 grand for this machine. It's like weighs 1,000 pounds or something, you know, wow. And it's like, and it's not that heavy, but it's very heavy. And yeah, so then it's like onto this turntable essentially. It's, you know, it's life size, and we just rotate it and scan it, and then we get it in. There is some skill to that. It takes some doing, figuring out exactly how that works, because like a very reflective surface doesn't scan well because the way that the lasers bounce. So like we found that if you put powder on it, for example, it'll scan better. Some areas get a little crunchy and you might want to scan again, or you might have, there's like these little dots that you got to put on there so that it can see all the points in space. So there's kind of a lot to it, but it is very technical, and we would do that whenever possible. We would buy clothes and stuff. We have like a male and female base mesh that we would use for the bodies. There's really only 2 body types, and then if we wanted them to have like make them look more beefy and strong or something, we just kind of like add a little more size or whatever. It wasn't anything too crazy in terms of like, you know, it's a realistic game, so people, even somebody that is like way bigger than somebody else from reality's sake, right. It's like there's really not that big of a difference in measurement, you know. And oftentimes they had full clothes on, that stuff was covered up anyway. So a lot of times, you know, the body was essentially taken care of. We have the head scanned, and what we were doing is scanning clothes when we can, or making them from scratch, and just trying to make stuff as fast as possible. A lot of reuse stuff. So like if we had a pack from somewhere that was scanned previously, and it could be from something that we scanned from the first World War II game, and we're like, okay, we can do better with this now. We can make it look cooler and more high res. So then we would actually just use that scan and remake it from there.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I think that totally makes sense with how tight y'all's release frame is, right? I mean, you gotta go as fast as humanly possible. Yeah.
So any way we can do that and still create stuff at a high quality level, we would. There's this like general sense of less is more, and quality over quantity, because really like we can create a few things and make it really high quality, and then figure out ways to intelligently reuse that where you might not notice that it's being reused so much. And especially on like army guys, right? Like there's like a lot of them have these like certain kinds of packs and things that you know one person has and the other person just has in a different spot, essentially, you know.
Yeah. And I know it's funny too, like a lot of people over the years have brought up like NPCs you kill in a game like a Call of Duty. It's like, oh, that, you know, they all look the same, or there's like 3 different types of of guys that you take out, sort of thing. Once again, right? I mean, it comes down to a necessity thing, and how many character models can you actually pump out?
Yeah. That's actually an interesting segue, because when we were making Vanguard, so essentially there's a lead that I had above me, and he had a ton of experience. He's really, really good at what he does. And one thing that was really cool about working with him is he had been there for a while, and he had like this huge knowledge base of like what we had in our various like files and folders. Like he just kind of like knew where to find stuff, right? Because a lot of what we were doing was reusing stuff, which was super, super helpful. But he had the idea that we would, from experience, that we would work on the enemies first, like the general enemies, because what oftentimes happens when working on a game is you get better as you get further into production. And so these enemies that you see from a distance on screen, generally speaking, well, if they're not as cool looking as the main cast of players, that's better, right?
Right. Those are disposable.
Yeah. So sometimes I think if you are like planning things the best way possible, those enemies that you see up close when they're killed or whatever, maybe you're just inspecting them or something. They tend to not be quite as good as some of the player models, and that's generally the reason. Because, like you said, it's just like you have a limited amount of time, especially on the schedule that we had. So it's just about, again, trying to produce the best thing, reasonably so, as fast as possible.
Right. And when you're like you're topologizing these meshes, and you say you had like sort of a female and a male body already kind of to work off of. What are kind of the steps in terms of topology? Do you take those meshes and kind of beat them up a little bit at first in terms of the topology? Or are you trying to just always keep it as low poly as possible throughout the creation process?
Yeah, that's a good question. So essentially, it's better to definitely make them more high res than what you probably will ship with, because it's a lot easier to downsize than to upsize. You can, I mean, realistically, like we would have, so we have LODs in the game, level of details where there's like the highest level and then a low level that's like extremely chunky. So that's just how many polygons there are. So level 0 is the most polygons possible, and that's what we're authoring our characters as, is level 0. Level 0 is only seen in the character select screen. Once you start playing the game, you're already level 1. So, like, it's like there's a lot of like auto LODing stuff that takes place that we're not actually. There's some specific situations where we would manually LOD characters. Like one thing that we would do was we would do that on corpses, because of the fact that there'd be like potentially so many of them, and you see them at a distance. That made sense. But for the most part, we use an auto LOD system. So mostly what we're doing is just being reasonable. We had like certain guidelines for the polygon count that we would aim for. And we would just try to make it look really cool. If something looked a little bit like, when it comes to polygons and being efficient there, the biggest thing that you'll start to notice is potentially stretching in the textures, where things look a little bit muddy or weird due to low topology. So like if like a common situation would be an area in like around a shoulder where things could deform a lot and stretch a lot. And then the other situation is just looking at the silhouette. So like if the character is moving around, you don't want to see like this knee that bends and then has like a hard angle that looks like a box, right? So we want to give topology where we need it for deformation, and just see it in these different poses and not looking boxy, looking fluid and organic. And that's pretty much the name of the game, like just being reasonable. I don't remember the exact numbers for what we had. There's a guideline sheet, but there might have been something like, it might have been like max 120,000 for the body area or something. But that was also, like I said, it was kind of give or take, because there was some characters, like I worked on this character named Gustavo, who was a guy in a ghillie suit, and he had just tons and tons of these, those, I don't know what they call them, like those little like camo strips. So it's like, in order for that to look smooth with all those strips, it's like, yeah, you got to use a lot of polygons. So the design itself can sometimes dictate how many you use.
Right. But, what about like hair? I feel like hair over the years continues to look better and better, particularly these really big games like the ones you work on. But also, I know like everybody in World War II is wearing helmets and stuff. But having played the game, I know there's still plenty of times when especially in the cutscenes and stuff, when people, you see the hair. But I mean, it's incredibly, which I know also has a lot to do with the animation, but I'm sure that, is set up with what you guys do before it gets to that point. So I'd love to hear about just hair, working with hair and character models.
Hair is like a very unique beast in video games. It is a big challenge because the fact is like if you don't go with hair cards and you go with splines, it's just a worlds apart more expensive. Now those things are changing. Actually, like we're Unreal now supports hair splines, and I think hair cards will be done away with in the near future. I'm already working on stuff where I have characters in Unreal leveraging that tech. So me personally, I haven't done a lot of hair card type stuff on characters. I'm aware of the workflow for it, and I have done some things. But there's sort of like what happens with hair is there's usually like specialists now that are just like hair card specialists, and all they do is work on hair. And a lot of times what we do is we don't even have specialists in studio. We'll outsource that stuff. So there's like outsourced studios that all they do is hair, And so it's also very interdependent on the engine itself, the way that the engine renders it. So there's some tricks involved in sort of getting it to look right and work in any given engine. It's not going to be the same from one engine to the next. And I did actually have some hand at helping with the way that the hair ambient occlusion worked on this UV map 2 for Call of Duty. And so it's like it becomes very technical working on hair. It is something that I didn't personally do on Call of Duty. We had a guy, the head specialist I mentioned previously. He basically took whatever outsourcing gave us and then made it work with the heads. So that was very involved, and that was kind of like what we did. So I saw the hair when I was working. So when we were exporting characters, oftentimes to the game, oftentimes we would have to, fit helmets and things on them, and then so we would be exporting with the hair or without the hair, depending on certain headgear and stuff. So I had to deal with it a little bit here and there. I had to move some stuff around sometimes to make it look better. But yeah, that's kind of the whole thing with hair. It's just very, very technical, very specific to the engine and what you're trying to do, and hopefully they will do away with the cards and just start using grooming systems like you use with XGen. So
take me through like a card versus a spline in terms of the benefits of that.
Yeah,
of going to spline.
Yeah, so like essentially like a hair card is like a plane with like a few because it has to bend, it's going to have subdivisions vertically so that it can actually like bend around as you would need, but it doesn't normally, unless it's like a dreadlock or something, it doesn't really have to be like a cylinder. It's usually just flat. And so
is it similar to like how people used to do trees kind of thing, or like the leaves in the trees sort of deal?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And so you have this card, you have alpha, so that it's like a cutout with the actual like individual strands. Just they're only visible because of the alpha on the card.
Right.
And so, but we bake those so that we get really good results. And generally, the way that those are baked is you will use a spline system, which actually creates geo hair, and then you bake it onto strips. So it's all a bunch of trickery to get these cards to look like the spline systems, which are like, if you know how to do it, those things are like pretty much perfect. And so it's like there's a layering system, like in terms of like the workflow. The best way to do it is to like layer on like all these like base style. You have different styles of hair on cards, and so there's like a base style that's like more dense and more full, and then you have like a second layer, major layer, where it's like a little more like see-through, and you might have some variations there to use, and you just do it one by one and manipulate them until you get them in the right spots. And then you have like flyaway hairs, which are like these little tiny hairs that you can just see like kind of, because anytime you look at a hairstyle in real life, you always have like individual hairs that are kind of like off in weird places. So you want to like simulate simulate that as well. And it's really just like a lot of like looking at reference and understanding how this works, and then trying to use these cards. You'll have like basically like a little like set of cards that you've baked from real splines in an intelligent way, and then you are just using those to build the hairstyle that you need on the given head that comes in bald, which is also a big challenge because seeing a bald head and trying to get the hair on there is a little bit intimidating. It's like hard to just establish where the hairline really is going to be.
Right. You have nothing really to work off of at that point.
Yeah. So,
but
yeah, I mean, the people that do it, they're great at it, and I've seen, we've all seen good hair and bad hair, but like. They're definitely getting better at it, but if we really want the best, it's going to be spline based, and that's going to be very similar to what they use in film.
The thing that sort of blows my mind now is like if there's a character running around with ponytail in a game, and like making sure that ponytail is moving, like especially like in a Call of Duty game, right? It was so fast paced, particularly the multiplayer, you run around everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
Making sure that hair is bouncing the exact right way.
Yeah.
In response to how the character is animated. I mean, is there like, I hate to spend like 30 minutes talking about hair, but I just think it's fascinating, the advancements that have happened. But like when you got like the character running and then you got the hairs, there's like two separate sort of systems working together.
Yeah, that's true. So essentially, like there's sort of like two ways to skin something for rigging purposes. You have your 1-to-1 skins, which are generally most objects are going to be 1-to-1. So you say, okay, I want the forearm to follow the forearm bone up until the point where it gets sort of to the midsection where where the crease of the bicep is, and then it's sort of getting blended into the upper bone by the bicep, so that it can deform properly. Now those are like more 1-to-1 blends in skinning. Then you have things that are dynamic, and you can make them fully dynamic. So like if you want to make things look more realistic, like with your little packs and stuff on the hips, those are probably going to be dynamic, and they are attached to points on the model. So you can have like your water jug that's sort of flopping around when you run, and they can control like how stiff those dynamics play. One of the really tricky cases is anytime you have like a long cape or something, or trench coat. That's going to be like a mix of the like 1-to-1 skinning and the dynamics, because it needs to be flapping around when you're running, but things can get crazy real fast with it because it can like flip inside out and do crazy things. You've probably seen that also.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a blend of those two things. Some things are fully dynamic. I imagine in the case of like ponytail, you'd probably just like right around wherever that hairband is, just leave the rest of it fully dynamic and make it sort of stiff with the way that it's bouncing around. But again, there's like different technical things per engine. So whether or not they have more control than that, it would really depend on the engine.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Cool. Thanks for indulging my interest in hair in games.
No problem.
So do you guys start texturing before rigging and animation is done, or when does that process start?
Yeah, ideally we would always texture before rigging and animation. There has been a few cases where we're in a bit of a crunch with time. Normally, like in those situations when we're like really strapped for time, it's because there's been some like high level back and forth in terms of like what they want to do with the design of something. We had this one such case specifically with Call of Duty and Vanguard. We had for this multiplayer this thing called, I think they called it Monsterverse, which was essentially like we had some of the main characters sort of dressed up as like one was a Godzilla, one was King Kong, and one was the lizard guy. I don't know what his name is. And so like we had our own versions of concepts for those, and they just were very, very undecided on the concept side of it. And so we can't work on it until they're like, okay, let's go with this concept. And they just kept on like delaying it. And we knew that there was like very hard deadlines in terms of like when this could actually be released, because it was like supposed to be for one of these season passes. And And so eventually they're like, okay, you got this. Now you just like make it. But then like literally if we made it in the normal amount of time that we would make it, that would give rigging and animation 0 time. So there was like a bit of a like, okay, we'll get this in the best state we possibly can, hand it off to you to work on it. There is gonna inevitably be some back and forth. Like you can never just hand something off and it's perfect, because you might just notice like, oh wait, there's like something wrong with the UVs here and the textures are warped when it's being animated, and like I need to like fix that now. And it was like an obvious mistake, but I just didn't see it because we were like crunching trying to get it done, stuff like that. So that does happen. But most of the time, actually, it was the opposite, which is ideal for us as character artists, because we had a big debt in rigging and skinning throughout most of the project. And so we actually had all these characters done, and they just weren't even picked up yet from rigging and skinning when we were working on the single player stuff. So that's cool for us, because if we come back to it and we have to mess with it, we're not stepping on anybody's toes and being like, oh, whoa, you're going to have to redo some of your work now because we got to fix something, you know?
Yeah.
So I prefer that, but there are times in game development where it's just totally unavoidable that you have to like sort of work on things at the same time, and it gets kind of hairy sometimes.
Yeah, that can definitely get messy. So when you guys are texturing stuff, what are some techniques, some methodologies you guys use?
So texturing is so much based on the style of art you're going for. Now we did everything in consideration for PBR rendering, which is physically based rendering.
Right.
Everybody talks about that now. It's sort of like a buzzword, I guess. Not a lot of people know what it is exactly, because when it comes down to it, I've worked with plenty of artists, oh yeah, I know what PBR is, I know what it is, and they're doing it wrong, because essentially it is like very specific and non-intuitive in some cases. Like an example of that is if you're working on something metal, there's 2 workflows. There's a spec gloss workflow, that's what we used on Call of Duty. There's also a metalness and roughness workflow, and that's generally what's used in any engine. Anybody who's using the Unreal Engine. There's pluses and minuses to both. We chose the spec gloss, which I think is better for a number of reasons. Not quite as optimized as the metalness roughness. But anyways, those details aside, a lot of consideration is taking place just in what workflow you're using. Is it with a PBR workflow? And then once you've established that, then it's like in a realistic game, because you don't have to be realistic to use a PBR workflow.
Right.
But like for us, using that, we kind of broke things down. Now we use Substance Painter specifically for our texturing. And because a lot of the stuff was scanned and we're reusing a lot of things, on this particular project, we spent most of our time in Substance Painter. So that's essentially, Substance Painter is just like a somewhat procedural type painting, texturing, authoring tool. And it you can just essentially use all kinds of layers and just build things up. So essentially, like what I would be doing is I'd be thinking about like the construction of something in great detail, and I'd be really like analyzing something in great detail. Now, for example, like if I was talking about just the basic shirt, I'm going to start out with just thinking, okay, what color is it? How shiny is it? What specular value does it have? Like, is there value to it? Are there like little dots in it and stuff? So you create some noise. So you do like another layer. So you have like your base layer that's just like real base values, and then you have another layer, and then you'll like set up like maybe there's some noisy detail, maybe there's a pattern. So then you'll actually like use a texture that's tiling for that pattern, and then then you work on that. There's usually cloudiness. It's not like solid color or anything. We always avoid adding lighting to anything in this workflow because that'll actually break it from reality. It can make it look nicer in some cases. We would actually intentionally bake some darkness into certain areas where like things were always overlapping. But for the most part, we wouldn't do much lighting type stuff baked into our textures. And then we're leveraging our bakes, which the normals and the curvature and all those things, they help drive some of these like automated things. Like you can add a layer that's sort of like dirt and crevices, for example. and then it kind of looks at like the curvature of certain things with the normal maps and stuff. It identifies things, and then usually the base filters that you use to like identify certain areas to help speed things up. Because if I was painting every little tiny crack by hand, it takes ages. But if you can do somehow procedurally, you save so much time. And then maybe I'm just gonna like multiply some alpha on top of it that breaks up those edges, so it's not perfect in every little crease. And then maybe I'm gonna like at the very end like paint some hand authored strokes with grunge brushes and stuff that I have. And that's generally how it is. It's like you have like your base stuff, and then just like the base values for things like the shirt's base values, and then you're starting to like just add to that complexity. And in the very end, you're generally doing things like adding like dirt and wear and things like that, where it's like, okay, if this is a belt and he's always got these packs on the side, maybe there's like the packs are always rubbing on the belt and it's starting to wear it down, and so it looks like it's like real deep red, and then it's real light colored where these packs have been rubbing. And we're doing stuff with that level of detail where, you know, I'm thinking about like blood spatter and things like that could happen because he's like shooting some gun or so a lot of the love went into the textures. And really, like, as long as video games have been around, that's where all the magic happens, is in the textures.
Yeah, and I think too, one thing you're talking about that I really like about where textures are now is just sort of, it's like a smorgasbord, right? There's some hand painted stuff, there's scanning, you know, and how you incorporate that all into all the different maps you make, I think is really, really cool. Because when I was at school, like it was a lot of hand painted stuff. Like we were hand painting textures, everything's tileable, to the point where it was like we weren't really using, at least I wasn't using ZBrush, and things like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, we'll even use ZBrush for things that people usually don't think you would use ZBrush for, like hard surface stuff, because there is some level of deformation happening. Like, not every edge on a gun is going to be perfect. You know, some of them are going to be scruffed up, and it's that micro detail that really sells it a lot of times, believe it or not.
Yeah, and it just gives it like you're talking about with the belt and everything, right? It just gives it that extra sort of lived in real world feel. And the crazy thing to me is just looking at, you know, Call of Duty games from, you know, like the original Modern Warfare to where you guys are now. It's incredible the level of visual fidelity, how it's just completely transformed. We were talking to Sean Bell, who is art director on the Black Ops, or one of the art directors on Black Ops series, a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about how photogrammetry has just completely changed the way that textures are done. Yeah.
Actually, that's interesting that he was talking about that, because so there's two methods to scanning something. You can use photogrammetry, or I'm probably saying that wrong, honestly, but it's essentially like it's a tough one.
It is.
But you can use that method, and that will capture color detail, so that helps a lot with texturing. However, there's usually a kind of like reduced value in terms of or quality level in terms of the scan that you get from that, at least with the rigs that we had. So oftentimes what we would do is we would use our really high tech scanner that I mentioned previously, and that would literally just give us a super high resolution 3D scan, much greater than photogrammetry, what you got there. But that was the trade-off, right? So, and also we couldn't actually scan things properly with our photogrammetry rig because if they were too large. So like a full outfit, we couldn't really get it scanned properly. But this giant ATOS scanner, I think it was called, that one, it could do like huge stuff. So that was like kind of like, at least with our systems, the pluses and minuses. And so essentially like the difference is like if we use that ATOS scanner, the really high resolution one that did not have color in it, we could get detail that was like somehow like you get like a seam on the end. You capture the stitches for the most part, and you could actually kind of go around the seam, like to the point where like, you know, on shoes you have like wherever you have seams, there's like almost like layering of some material. Like you could see some of that. So it was insanity. But But so that's why that was another reason why we spent a lot of time texturing things, because we actually didn't have any color data whenever we were texturing. But in a way, it's kind of cool because like whenever I'm texturing something, I'm considering every single layer that I use, what is going to be the gloss and spec and these other values besides color. And so I can get it like exact if I'm hand authoring things, like like every little dot on there. Maybe that's like maybe I decide that these dots have like a different value for gloss. Well, I'm making it so I can do that. If I have something that's scanned with color data, it's pretty hard to pinpoint those kinds of things. Not going to say you can't, but it's a different thing entirely.
Is it tough not really thinking about lighting when you're doing that stuff? Or is it just easy to kind of take what you guys have done, and then the environment artist or the lighting team is able to sort of make what you guys have created work?
Yeah. So in terms of like the more you work on stuff, the better you get at that. It can be really tricky at first. Now in Substance Painter specifically, where we did all our texture authoring, we would use a very specific HDRI map that didn't have like very much color in it, and then we would always turn on the background and make sure it's not blurred, so you get like a sense of like how the environment is reacting to the texturing you're doing, which is insanely important when doing texturing. Like it doesn't seem like it would be, but trust me, like if you try to texture without having these different things sort of set up, it's like you don't have like a sense of like understanding of the color value until you start seeing it in this like sort of like neutralized state. Kind of an example I can give you just from an artistic standpoint is if you're painting something at night, essentially everything is going to be kind of blue. And then if you wanted to paint something red on an object in a blue lit place, it's actually not going to be red. If you painted it red, it'd be like crazy hot, like totally unrealistic. What it really is a very desaturated blue. So if you paint something super desaturated in a fully blue lit room, it looks to your eyes red. And so that's just like how your eyes sort of perceive the world. And what you want is you want some ability to perceive your textures in a proper environment. So we had a certain setup that we would use that would be very similar to what we got in the game engine. It's not one-to-one, like especially when it came to specular values, but it was pretty close. And the more you practiced at it, the better you could guess what it's going to look like in the game. And then at the very end, you get in the game, you're like, oh, I need to change this, and that. Go ahead and change it. Oh, I need to change this, and that. So there's a little bit back and forth, but for the most part, you can do all the texturing straight up in that Substance Painter. And the cool thing also about working in Substance Painter is I just have all these different fill layers with different values. So if I'm like, okay, I need to change that gold color is all wrong, then I can just like change the gold color uniformly on everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for like on the rigging and animation side, I know you said you don't really touch that, but are you in contact with those guys, letting them know what's going on with these characters, giving them sneak peeks of iterations, things like that?
Yeah, we probably didn't do the best job communicating with them like ahead of time in terms of like what we were doing. Like our team didn't actually communicate with a lot of the other teams in terms of like what was coming online until it was like already almost done. Our lead like mostly did a lot of the communication to the higher ups about things like that, and then that didn't really get filtered down to like animation and rigging so much. But to be fair, like I said, during most of production, rigging had their hands full, and they like weren't even working on the stuff that was coming online anyway.
Right.
So it wasn't super imperative for us. But then there is definitely a big something that is very important is whenever we would hand off the characters to rigging and skinning, that we actually so what we did is we eventually set up like a few meetings. It used to be like actually 3 meetings a week, I think, at one point. And I wasn't initially on this team, but then I eventually got put onto it. And essentially what it was just like a review of the rigging and skinning. And so we would sit in there and watch the characters run around and go through certain poses and stuff and just make sure everything was looking correct. And when they don't know the characters as intimately as we do, it's easy for them to miss stuff. And so like we're able to like give them feedback so that they can make it look as good as possible. So that part is like super important, like kind of giving feedback in that direction. But even still, things happen so fast that they can get entirely missed. Like there's this one character that I worked on that was like one of the main character NPCs, and he was communicating with like you as the main player, and then I just see like his strap like popping through his chest. Like during the conversation, I'm like, God damn it, man! Like this is you could have got this so easy. I had no idea this was happening. You know?
Yeah.
So,
do you ever have to like take something back, like if a model doesn't work with a rig or something like that, or
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's mostly like a design issue, whereas like we have a concept and the guy has a knife and it's on his waistband, and you're like, oh yeah, that's cool. It's like it's kind of standing out, because usually like you're thinking about things from a design perspective, like small, medium, large shapes, and that things sort of flow across the character, and it's not just all like willy nilly happening there. It's all like well thought out. So you're like, oh yeah, that's a cool place. That's unique for that like big gnarly knife. And then you see it animated and you're like, oh, that's just like going right into his junk. Like like as soon as he like crouches, it's just like intersecting with his legs and stuff, you know? And so you're like, okay, well, clearly that's not going to work. There's not a lot you can do there, because it has to attach to that point, and he has to be in these extreme poses. So you can't bend a knife. It's a solid object. Right. So really it's just like, okay, we're just going to scoot it over to the side a little bit and everything will be fine. And so there's stuff like that all the time, essentially.
Yeah. So what's a typical turnaround time for a model then, from like the concept to when you guys are done with it?
With a lot of the enemies, it was a lot faster. Well, honestly, it was a little bit slower in the beginning, because we were just sort of figuring out these pipelines in the beginning, and sort of getting a better understanding where everything lives. But like it's so dependent on. Well, sometimes we would put more love into certain characters because we knew they were really important. But a lot of it really just is all about how much unique stuff is going to be on that character to make it look like we want it to look in the concept. Like there's some characters that I worked on that were there's like literally nothing on them that was reuse. And so if that's the case, then it's going to take way longer than a character that is like 70% reuse. Right. So it really comes down to that. Now, if you're doing something that's mostly reuse, I don't know, it might take like a month, maybe 6 weeks. If you're doing something that is like incredibly, like just totally unique like that, it could take upwards of 3 months for a character artist to make. And granted, like if you're a character artist and you're not the one who says, yes, this is good, no, it's not good, it's always going to take a lot longer for you, no matter how good you are, because they can always just be like, nope, I don't like it, change this, this, and that, And so it's much harder the further down leadership you are to sort of like get the okay on it. So that is a little bit like of an unfair advantage, like the higher up you are, but yeah, so like iteration's a big thing in terms of like how long stuff takes as well.
Yeah. So stepping away from that side of your career, take us through the Mentor Coalition thing that you're a part of. What's that like?
Oh yeah. So for me, honestly, it's kind of like this. It's basically Josh Lynch is the founder of that, and his wife helps him a lot with that. So it's the two of them really, and I actually knew Josh when I went to college with him at University of Advancing Technology back a long time ago. I think it was like 2006 or something, 2005 maybe. And so Josh sort of made a big name for himself working in Substance Designer as a material artist. And what was happening is he was it's a very technical skill set to work in Substance Designer. And it was also very new at the time that he picked it up, and there weren't a lot of people that knew how to use it. So what wound up happening is people would all the time contact him for help learning how to do it. And so eventually he was like, okay, this mentorship thing, I'm not going to spend all my time. I have limited time. I'm not going to spend all my time for nothing. But I do want to help people. So he basically started doing mentoring himself, and quickly became overwhelmed and decided that he wanted to make an actual like website where people could go to for mentorships. And maybe it's not just in Substance Designer. Maybe it's like across the board. And so he did that. It was a huge undertaking, and so he had a bunch of mentors in various areas that that people would, they'd use the website and decide, like, he had like a system for how much time, like different packages for how much time you get with your mentor, and honestly, it's not the cheapest thing in the world, but it's, in my opinion, like well worth it. Just because I know how hard it is to sometimes figure out this stuff, that like the time saving, it's all about saving time in the end, in my opinion, because your time is limited in terms of like learning this stuff. There's just so much to it. So if you can speed that up, I think it's worth it. But there is a lot of this information is available on the internet if you're willing to dig around for it. But yeah, so that's essentially what it is. It's just literally a place, and this is becoming more and more popular. By the way, there's other companies that have similar type plans set up for people to get professional mentors. I actually joined Josh when he was getting like a huge influx of demand for character artists to be mentors, and so he's like, hey, we have this huge demand for character artists. We can't keep up with it. It's like the second, somebody becomes available, they're getting booked. So would you be willing to do it? And I was like, yeah, sure. I'll give it a shot. And so I've been doing it for, I think it's been like a little over a year, maybe, I don't know, maybe even longer than that. But it's been going really well. I just leave one slot open for this mentorship per month, and sometimes it gets filled, sometimes it doesn't, and I'm cool either way, because like honestly, like this isn't so much for me. Like some people, maybe it's a side hustle, they're trying to make a bunch of money. For me, it's just a way to get more exposure and to get more practice training people, because I think that's really important. And it's nice to give back too. I mean, obviously it's not totally free, but it's something that is valuable for both parties in this case.
Yeah, and is there like a program kind of devised when you have a student, or is it kind of like they come to you with what they want to know, or what's the kind of curriculum, I guess?
Exactly. So they start out kind of like in the place of either they come to me directly and say, hey, they don't contact me personally, but they contact the Mentor Coalition. Right. Erin is the one that deals with a lot of the people there and coordinates, but she will communicate with them, and they might say, I love Brad's stuff. I think he would be a great mentor for me. I'd like to sign up, and they proceed. Or it could be that they contact the Mentor Coalition. They're like, hey, I'm trying to become a better character artist. I want to learn more about Hard Surface and ZBrush. Is there anybody that you can recommend? Aaron might shoot out an email to all the character artists at the Mentor Coalition and be like, is anybody wanting to help this person out? And then you can sort of like offer to do that, and then you may get them. But essentially, like whenever, like I have areas that I will train people up on, and anybody that sort of like is in that vein. Honestly, it's usually most things 3D art, because I've done it all at this point. But I'm willing to sort of help people with almost anything in the 3D art realm specifically. Now, if they wanted to do concept art or something, I don't think that I would be good enough for that, or at least they could probably do better than me. Yeah, and so essentially they're like, if they want to learn something specific like Hard Surface and ZBrush, I think that I probably am one of the better options there, personally. So I've actually made some tutorials. Like there's like a YouTube where I went over that process. And kind of like what happens is for me is that I find that I only have a limited amount of time with the students, and it's really important to me that they get the most out of the program. Like again, like I'm not just doing it for money. I'm mostly doing it to help people out and to kind of like get a little more exposure. I think that's more important than anything else. And so I'll like usually spend more time than what I probably should be with the mentee. And I also try to think about things in the long term where I can set things up so I can be like, look, this kind of tutorial doesn't really exist online, but I'm going to record some stuff, and it's like 2 hours of me sculpting and explaining things, and that'll sort of answer that question, and then we can go over the specifics in the limited amount of time that we have on our talks. Because if I'm just like doing this like rinse and repeat with every person, like they're not going to get nearly as much out of it. So I want them to have a lot of time to ask more specific, in-depth questions that, areas where I can unblock them is sort of the main thing, and not just like teach somebody something from square one, because that takes forever. So
yeah, that sounds cool, especially like tailoring sort of to their needs and being able to make every, I imagine mentee feel like, unique in a way. It's not just some generic stuff that you could throw at anybody. It's not a one size fits all operation.
Yeah, totally. And for me, like I said, it becomes more time intensive than I want, but the hope is that eventually it's like not so time intensive, because I can be like, hey, I made this thing for you actually that talks about just that, and then
right.
then I won't be spending all that extra time. But yeah, I mean, I think, and sometimes honestly, it could just be literally like, hey, I'm doing something this way. Is that the right way? Like, I don't know. This feels really hard. Or I'd be like, oh yeah, that's mostly the right way. It's just like there's a couple little tricks here that'll make it like slightly easier for you, and that's all they need,
Yeah.
So.
And do you also give advice at all to people in terms of like professionally what they should be doing in terms of like portfolio and things like that? Or do people come to you with questions about that?
Yeah, definitely. Like I always want to kind of like close the loop on that if possible. Sometimes we don't always have the time to do it, but I do think that that's really, really important. Like, you can really make the best model in the world, and if you just don't light and render it properly, it can look like garbage. So it's like you did all the right things artistically speaking. I mean, there is artistry to lighting and rendering, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, like you did the hard work, but you're still not like reaping the rewards of making something so awesome just because you're not spending time on these things or understanding how to do it. So part of that might be the training side of it, but at the end, like you really need to know how to present your work. Because if you don't, it's like you might as well have not made it almost, So that stuff is really important in terms of like helping people with portfolio, letting them understand more about like how to leverage social media or how to apply, or like I also have some people that already work in the game industry, and I can just be giving them like general tips and advice about how I think that they might go about doing things so that they move forward in their career like more in the long term. There's sometimes stuff like it's more like business related, where it's like the people that I know are all artists, and they tend to shy away from a lot of the business stuff, or they feel uncomfortable asking for a raise or even understanding what their value is. And so I can talk to them about that specifically, because that's one of those areas where like people are sort of afraid to even talk about sometimes.
Yeah.
And having the one-on-one experience is just so much different than like trying to ask that otherwise.
Yeah, well, I love that you do that, because I think you're exactly right. There's so many people, art side, programming side, whatever, almost in all areas of the industry that maybe are trying to break in, or students or whatever, that they don't know how to talk to people about these things, and they might want to learn, but they just don't know how to approach it. So the fact that you could provide that information as well as the technical know-how, I think is just invaluable.
Yeah, totally. And that kind of goes back to the thing that I was saying initially. It was like about how I just see it as time saving, because the way that I figured out most of this stuff is by failing over and over and over again, And so I'm saving you that. So, hey, maybe you have this little talk with me and you get a $10,000 raise, Well, it doesn't cost $10,000 for this, like there you go. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not always going to be so cut and dry, but I feel like once people have the tools, it's so worth it,
Yeah, for sure. Brad, thanks a lot for talking to us today. Is there anything you want to plug on your way out? We always want to give people a chance to promote whatever they want to promote before they wrap up the interview.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't have anything specifically planned, but my name is Brad Myers. If you look up Brad Myers on ArtStation, the last name is spelled Myers, by the way. Sometimes people spell it with an E. If you look me up on ArtStation, you can see my work. If you look up the Mentor Coalition, you can find information about me there with the mentors there. I have an Instagram. I think it's probably Brad M3D is the name on that Instagram. So as long as you know my first and last name, you should be able to find me various places. And if anybody ever wants to reach out for me for advice, I'm happy. I try to answer every email that I get. So I'll be happy to do that.
Well, cool, man. Brad, thanks for talking to me about hair for an hour and a half. Appreciate it. And
it's been awesome.
That's a lot of fun.
I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, that'd be a blast.
All right.
Thanks again.
Yeah. Talk to you later.
All right, that's going to wrap up this week's episode. We want to thank Brad again for being our guest. To find out more about Mudstack, head over to mudstack.com, where you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and join our community on Discord. And of course, we want to thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on Clear as Mud.